Doesn't grow very well there. I mean, you'd think that people would pick us to start their civilization, that mankind would pick some well-watered, rainy area, maybe even North America, someplace, but it wasn't. It wasn't that way. They picked Sumeria. The Sumerians were probably the most creative and inventive people on earth, unless modern-day Westerners are. What did they invent? Well, as far as we know, they were the ones who domesticated the sheep, the goat, the pig, the cow, the ox, the cat, the dog. And in the way of plants, they domesticated wheat, rye, barley, the grains, not corn. That was done by the American Indians. No, they didn't have the turkey. That was a North American bird. But they taught mankind farming. They are a really strange, unique people. Now, I've already mentioned how that their writings have come down to us in their pure form, and we have, many, many hundreds of thousands of clay tablets, some of which have not been read. They look like they're just furniture inventories, which makes somewhat interesting reading to the historian, but not necessarily interesting reading to an ordinary person. Now, here's the problem we have with their writing, folk. We don't believe a word of it. What they wrote about is what we today would almost call fairy tales. All right, I want to elaborate on fairy tales. Typically, your fairy tale is something you read about in elementary school. They begin with such words as once upon a time, or another beginning is long ago and far away. There's another beginning to a fairy tale. Fairy tales can oftentimes begin with back when I was in the Army. I heard that from one of my drill sergeants when I was in the Army, back when I was in the Army. He said what follows usually is a fairy tale. Fairy tales have an ending. Who knows how fairy tales usually end? And they lived happily ever after. I can't help it. I just turned 65, and yes, I collect Social Security. But I can't help but recall reading about this man who was reading to his young daughter. The book was entitled Fairy Tales, and they lived happily ever after on Social Security. Fairy tale. All right. The difference between their fairy tales and ours is their fairy tales did not begin with long ago and far away. Their fairy tales are right here and right now, inside our own temples. Don't hold on your seats. Their gods were maintaining a physical presence, not statues, not idols, but a physical flesh and blood presence inside their temples. Folk, I can't prove they actually did, but I can prove from the records the Sumerians claimed they did, that not only did they eat and drink and sometimes walk in the streets, they also had the ability to fly. My opponents are the master of those who fly. They also cohabited with earth women and produced a race of hybrids who were half human and half god. If you want to let it, go ahead. Every ancient group of people, all the ancients believed this. The Greeks, who knows? Who was Hercules' father? Everybody, every student I asked knows that. At least I heard several answers. I assume all of them know that. Hercules' father was Zeus. Gilgamesh, 2/3 God and 1/3 mortal. How can that be? Both of his parents, his mother was half God and his father was all the way God. So do the math. Actually, his mother thinks was 3 eighths, his father a demon. So do the math. That would make him about 2/3 God, one. I mean, you've heard the story of Gilgamesh, have you not? In your literature classes, several of you nod your head. I mean, hey, all right, we tend to believe these things to be fairy tales. My graduate professor at UT, Dr. Bing Maname, did a paper that hardly any other professor agreed with, where he said he believed the document he had discovered was written by a man who would have known Gilgamesh. Just 2 generations after Gilgamesh would have lived, about 50 years after Gilgamesh would have died, He believes it's when this document was written. The man might have actually known him. Even though I must state Gilgamesh is not looked on as a historical figure. And in fact, most of what the Sumerians write about is looked on as being mythology. All right, what's a myth? Well, a myth is a story that includes gods. Every ancient group of people begins their history with stories that today we modern people call myths. The myths gave way to legends. What is a legend? Basically, it's a story about people who were demigods, half god and half human. Hercules, Gilgamesh, Icarus, legends. Then finally, into serious history. Herodotus is called the father of history. Well, Herodotus lived in 320 BCE. What about all the writings before then? Well, they're not considered history because they include stories of people who could turn themselves into snakes or turn themselves into lions. Thor not only had a hammer that would always return to his hand, but when he wanted a meal, he would just simply slaughter his oxen. And then when he was through eating the oxen, touch the ox with his hammer and he'd come back to life. Hey, folk. Now, the people living at that time, in the time period we're talking about, considered these stories to be serious history. Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, which we're talking when we come to Greece, was considered serious history. Gods were involved. Have you ever read Homer's Iliad and Odyssey? Several heads are nodding. Yeah. We consider them legends, or at least mythology or legends. The Greeks consider them serious history. The reason Herodotus is considered the father of history was he wrote his history and left out most of those stories. And shortly after the Thucydides came along, until the time of the Greeks, nobody questioned these kind of stories. Then along came the Greeks, they were somewhat more skeptical. Even the earlier Greeks, I mean, their stuff sounds highly mythological. How much of the myths do I personally believe? The more I read, the more convinced I am we ought to pay more attention to the stories that were told then. In fact, one author put it this way, that the myths do contain some kind of a hidden message that only the wise will someday be able to decipher. It's a message started at the beginning of time that will go through to time, and someday we'll understand them better. They were not just fanciful stories made up by people who needed it. But at least I don't think so. All right, that's as best an answer as I can give. Again, I can't prove that these events actually happened, but I can prove that the people at the time believed. What's the lesson about? I mean, well, I attend my faculty meetings, and the people in charge of college say, it's not about us teachers, it's not about, it's about you students. Fine and dandy, but I also want to say, my course is a lot about the people I'm talking about. Long, long dead, but whose ideas are or will come alive. Now, one problem that we had, I haven't heard this from anybody at Georgia Primitive, but one problem we had was, why study history? It's dead. The people are dead. Well, what is going on in the world today, and I'm talking about August 18, 2014, has never been more relevant. I mean, this has never made history seem more relevant. The conflicts. Where are the world's biggest conflicts happening? Middle East. Where did history begin? The conflicts that are going on today have their roots in the time period we're studying about. Extremely relevant. Now, one thing I'm going to do this semester I've never done. I usually have given Islam just one day, one lecture. I'm going to give it two this semester. Hopefully, as the reason is obvious. Islam has become extremely important. I did some things that changed my mind. I had we really need to understand Islam. We'll be talking more about it when we come to a later chapter. I am going to spend 3 days talking about chapter 1. Again, our origins, our roots. I do think it's that important. All right.